argument through 7 or 8 theses. I don't remember exactly how many there are. And I will start with the first one. So, archaeological heritage is not given in advance. It does not exist in and of itself, but is constructed through research. And archaeological traces are, by their very definition, fragmented, hidden, buried, and hard to recognize. For a trace, like this one, to become an archaeological heritage, it must go through a process of identification, registration, documentation, interpretation, and evaluation, research in short. So, which archaeological trace is recognized as archaeological heritage and which does not depends primarily on material possibilities, considerations, doctrines, and theories. So the process of protecting archaeological heritage is therefore a process of knowledge production. And I will review this process through the perspective of science, technology, and society studies, focusing mainly on development-led archaeology, focusing mainly on the development-led or preventive archaeology and the use of remote sensing in this process. So, my next thesis is that heritage is produced through cycles of accumulation. So, one key aspect of knowledge production are cycles of accumulation. For example, in cartography, the cycle of accumulation begins with sending a researcher to an unknown part of the world. The explorer returns with notes and map of the area, and then the next explorer does not go there barehanded, but is already equipped with a map the first explorer made. He returns home with a new, improved map and more accurate map. So the knowledge is created incrementally through process of layering, addition, and multiplication. In archaeology, and especially in the development-led or preventive archaeology, cycles of accumulation are carried out through increasingly intensive stages of research, from preliminary evaluation and assessment to a field work, different stages of field work that finishes with excavation, possibly. And those stages establish different forms, statuses, or aggregate states of heritage. And this process usually starts with an archaeological potential assessment, establishing archaeological potential, covering large areas, and through increasingly intensive research, this potential is actualized into well-defined, possibly excavated archaeological sites or not. An important innovation of preventive archaeology, development-led archaeology, especially in Slovenia, is the systematic application of remote sensing methods, which enable fast assessment of archaeological potential of large areas. Yeah, like this. So, another critical aspect of knowledge production is, if we return to the example from cartography, that explorers from distant lands return with notes, plans, and maps. When we look at the scientists doing archaeology at work, most of their time is devoted to the making records, pictures, images, graphs, plans, forms, sketches, photographs. And most of the time is devoted to coding reality and manipulating those codes. In the jargon of science and technology studies, those are called inscriptions, records that stabilize and consolidate certain relationships of the real world. Bruno Latour thus describes inscriptions as immutable and mobile, as they enable the travel and dissemination of information, therefore mobile, which still remains stable and coherent, therefore immutable. So the process of knowledge production process of knowledge production is thus a process of creating, combining, confronting, and assembling inscriptions into increasingly abstract and universal inscriptions, what Bruno Latour calls the cascade of inscriptions. And here, measurement tools and machines play a vital role in our contact with reality, as they condition what we write down, what we stabilize, and how. The inscription devices, as they are called, enable the observation of phenomena that cannot be perceived with our bodies alone, and formalize the observation. And those devices turn the concrete material phenomena into a record. These tools, inscription devices, really determine how we face reality, how we see it. So, archaeological traces are often invisible, fragmented, buried. In order to discover and identify them, we need inscription devices, which often determine what kind of traces we perceive and which become heritage. The choice and use of tools often determine our understanding of archaeological heritage. Thus, for example, geophysical methods detect different, often complementary aspects of archaeological traces than, for example, laser scanning, this is geophysics, or other remote sensing methods. And coming to the remote sensing methods are a fast, systematic, non-invasive, and relatively accessible way of obtaining data on archaeological traces in a landscape. For example, aerial archaeology is based on observation of signs such as different soil colors, differences in crop growth, and patterns of shadows that might indicate archaeological traces below the surface. And the aerial photography has a long history of use in archaeology. But in Slovenia has never had a significant impact on archaeological practice. There are several reasons. Most of Slovenia is covered with forest, is characterized by very rough topography and fragmented land use. The only significant successes of aerial photography are in Pannonian part of Slovenia, in Mlekuž, northeastern Slovenia. That is why the introduction of airborne laser scanning has been highly successful in Slovenia. So, a laser mounted on an aircraft illuminates the Earth's surface with laser beams. The device on the plane sends hundreds of thousands of laser beams per second, which allows us to cover large areas very quickly. It collects these measurements as a set of coordinates or a point cloud from which it is possible to obtain information about the shape of the object being scanned. So ILS, airborne laser scanning, has proven to be an extremely successful method due to its ability to observe the ground under the forest cover. Forests are places where archaeological traces are very well preserved, and large areas that were previously close to the systematic observation suddenly became visible. And using ILS, we have discovered and recorded a multitude of new traces of human activities in the past, such as sunken beds, terraces, cemeteries, land division boundaries, limestone kilns, charcoal burning platforms, quarries, etc., etc. Yeah, but the key locations of knowledge productions are the centers of calculation, a concept developed by Bruno Latour in his seminal Science in Action. So the centers of calculation are locations from where the cycles of accumulation are initiated and where inscriptions are accumulated. They can be either individuals, institutions, countries, or even regions that systematically enable, organize, and direct the cycles of accumulation. And returning to the example from the cartography, the centers of calculation overviews the white spots on the map, decides where to send explorers, and compiles and completes the map. And traditional centers of calculation in archaeology were mainly scientific and research institutions which coordinated large cycles of accumulation of archaeological knowledge. But with the introduction of preventive or development-led archaeology also meant a structural change in the discipline itself. Most archaeological research is now produced within preventive archaeology, primarily driven by development. Thus, new centers of calculation have emerged within the heritage sector that have to deal with the vast volumes of data produced. So the introduction and development of preventive archaeology in Slovenia also coincides with the introduction of new geoinformation technologies, especially geographic information systems and databases. And those enabled inscriptions obtained through research to be combined, analyzed, and managed in the long term. For example, data we manage includes the site gazetteer, which where around 14,000 sites are collected. Then we maintain a database that collects all information on archaeological research documented with report and currently comprises around 6,000 entries. This enables track of archaeological research within the territory of Slovenia, planning of new research, and enables fast response to the planning and development. And that's the extent of recorded interventions. And we also map the results of remote sensing surveys. The mapped features are classified into several categories, interpreted, and become kind of standardized entries, inscriptions in the information system. And this is the spatial extent of airborne laser scanning surveys. So standardized inscriptions are stored and combined into new knowledge. This archaeological heritage information system provides an overview of the number and extent of archaeological traces and the intensity of research, and enables very complex queries and visualizations. And this system enables the planning of new cycles of accumulation and management of the archaeological research in Slovenia. It has become de facto the center of calculation and the tool through which we produce new knowledge about the archaeological heritage in Slovenia. So over 80,000 different entries have accumulated in the information system in the last 10 years. The number of information on archaeological traces has increased by several orders of magnitude over the last 10 years. We are witnessing a phenomenon where the quality of archaeological traces transforms into a new quality. But what is this new quality? All these hill forts, Roman farms, Roman roads, barrows, sunken beds, fortifications, traces of conflict, lime kilns, charcoal burning platforms, mining traces, holloways, are traces of human life in a landscape. So the landscape is full of these traces. In fact, those traces make up the landscape. Archaeological heritage no longer appears as isolated points. This is how it looks. It's full of traces. Archaeological heritage no longer appears as isolated points in an empty space, but as a continuum of archaeological traces. It is no longer about individual sites, but about entire landscapes. And those traces are part of the modern landscape, of course. Otherwise, we would not be able to record them. Sometimes the modern landscape organically grew out of them, and later land users incorporated the old traces either because of their continuity of land use or because those traces were so massive and inert. And those traces testify of the time depth of the modern landscape. In some places of those traces appear, there are some examples. In some places, those traces appear, those traces were not touched by later use. The landscapes were either abandoned and remain in a fossil form. Those well-preserved patches of fossilized landscape can be found, for example, in marginal areas such as karst or under the forest. Here is an example of preserved region furrow medieval fields. Yeah. So individual protection of all these traces is unproductive. Not only because there are too many of them, but because by protecting them individually, we exclude them from the context of the landscape, freeze and close them. With individual protection, we also reduce their visibility as they are less important in themselves than the part of the whole, the landscape. So changes, interventions, and transformations are integral part of landscape. Cultural landscapes are cultural precisely because of the long history of changes, interventions, and transformations, and the landscape bears witness to the past changes. The landscape is materialized change. Landscapes are changes that are in the process of materialization. This brings us to the sixth thesis. Archaeological heritage is not just a collection of archaeological traces or an archaeological record that we create during research. What makes archaeological heritage is the meaning we attribute to it, its value. And values or meanings can only be determined in the context of society, its needs, issues, the dilemmas and opportunities. Heritage evaluation thus also requires sensitivity to society's dilemmas and an understanding of the social role of the discipline. So the production of heritage is thus primarily the production of meanings and values. Of course, archaeological heritage always has an inherent scientific value, the value of using it to understand the past. But is that enough? The social role of archaeology is changing. Archaeology is no longer just an academic study of the past, but a discipline that actively participates in the democratic process of decision-making, spatial planning, and development. The main products are no longer only monographic studies of specific problems, but reports and documents that enable decision makers to make informed decisions about the change in the landscape. So heritage cannot be protected by prohibitions alone. Heritage can be protected primarily through recognition of its meaning and value, why it's important to be preserved. And we as archaeologists can point to the great temporal depth of the landscape, to the multitude of traces that are forgotten, overlooked, ignored, but make up the landscape and contribute to its identity. To the fact that some modern landscapes took shape and basic features deep in the past. On the other hand, we can point to the long duration, temporality, and slow rhythms that shape the landscape and still define it today. Archaeologists can point to the continuities and changes that took place in the past. We can identify stable landscape as well as changes, breaks, and stoppages. And archaeology, as a science of the past others, can point to completely different uses of space, to the presence of others who lived perhaps in a radically different way on the same part of the Earth's surface as we. And archaeology can also point to the possibility of different development of landscape and history, to the contingency of the historical development. Archaeologists can recognize the depth of time in the landscape, point to the hidden and overlooked aspects, and offer alternative stories about the development of the landscape, of course, based on concrete scientific evidence and research, which separates archaeology from other increasingly aggressive voices and initiatives that want to give heritage its own meaning. So to sum up, returning to the initial thesis, archaeological heritage does not exist by itself, but is constructed through a process of research and evaluation. Heritage is no longer a collection of isolated monuments, sites, but the property of landscape. As such, archaeological heritage is often the site of many conflicting interests. And if we want to preserve heritage, our task is to recognize and argue for its value and meaning. Thus, our task as archaeologists is to construct the heritage as sound as possible. Because when people recognize something as their own heritage, as remnant of their past that have value and meaning, heritage will have enough allies to defend it against opposing interests. So when heritage is sufficiently well constructed, it will be able to defend itself. Thank you.